Recording in progress. All right, so for the second half, let's start off by going over the requirements for project 7. So don't forget that, as I mentioned earlier, one of your environments for project 6 becomes project 7. All right, now you guys will find reference and texture images that will be used on objects in the scene. Remember, not all objects need a texture. Okay, again, you are responsible for adding materials and colors to the elements that are visible in the render, including what is visible in the reflections. You're responsible for adding textures to all the elements that require them. Again, not all objects or elements will require a texture. Some will just use a material. Some you can texture with images right off the internet. Texturing does not imply just using Substance Painter. And remember, we've only got a requirement of 2 objects for Substance Painter, a wooden one and a metal one in your close-up. Most objects have been given UVs, but when you're assigning textures to them, you may have to redo your UVs to make the texture work with your geometry. So don't assume that, oh, everything's UV'd, why isn't my stuff working? Why doesn't it look right? Well, go in and make sure the UVs are lined up with your texture. So today we're going to be going over making the seamless brick wall, or brick texture, I should say. Tony Bagsby will be going over Sunday, doing some Substance Painter work. On Monday, we'll be doing projections in Maya. We'll also be doing opacity maps and layered textures in Maya. Layering basically in Maya. So read over this. If you have any questions, let us know. Don't forget, utilize that SAL look development guide that we have for you guys. Frank also did a good presentation for you in lab the other day. All right. So, any questions so far? So the first half, we found out why we need to make that brick repeatable. So let's go into Photoshop. Hopefully you've downloaded the PowerPoint file and the Photoshop files. So let me see if I can find them, because I have just a big mess of open windows here. Let's minimize all that nastiness. Here we go. All right. So here is the PowerPoint file. So let me launch that. All right, so if you kind of peruse this PowerPoint doc, you'll notice that we have just like a little introduction here. And then we've got the workflow for making the brick texture repeatable, which I'm going to go over with you, and also making a bump map. There is also a procedure for doing the wood that we provide. It's a red oak hardwood, and it can be applied to a floor. So it's a little bit different. The thing about a brick wall is bricks are mostly rectangles, straight lines, right angles, makes it pretty easy to make repeatable. Wood, on the other hand, this wood grain, well, it's got seams where the boards are, but it's also got grain, which is very organic and bendy, plus color variations. So there's a bunch of things you can do to do that. And there's also this kind of alligator skin reptile hide that we provide. This is cellular. It's got cells, but they're not straight lines. They're not right angles. They curve. It's very organic looking. And it's kind of a challenge to make that repeatable. So all those are optional if you want. We've also got a couple of videos tucked away in the playlist for Project 7, I believe, in our YouTube channel. But basically, this is what a scene looks like with those textures placed by default. Notice you can see the seams on the wall. You can see the seams on these little footstools, or it's like an ottoman cushion. You can sit on it, you put your feet on it. And also very noticeable seams on the floor. But after making them seamless, this is what the result is. So we go from this to this. And that's our goal, just with the wall anyway. We go from that to that. All right, now, appropriate reference. Well, reference is going to be what is either supplied to you or what you find. But always go by reference. For scale, go by reference for what it should look like in an environment. And then use that as reference to go get a texture that will work for you. Now, some things to avoid, which Frank went over this in finding reference, I'm sure. You don't want to have things with baked in lighting or shadows or reflections. A lot of those you can find on the internet. People take their own pictures and use them as textures, but they've either got flash in them, you know, somebody taking it with a flash on their camera turned on. They've taken it in a time of day where the shadows are noticeable, or they've got a reflective surface and the reflections in the actual environment are basically being captured. That won't work. Your environment's going to be different. Your lighting's not going to match up. So you want to avoid any textures that have that information already in them. You want your material to provide that for your scene. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, so if you've got something like a brushed metal pattern here, well, we can get this gradient look. That's reflectivity. That's an anisotropic reflection. All we would really need in order to make it is basically either a spec map or a bump map for all the brush strokes in that material. All right, so Photoshop, we'll kind of go into that in a second. Photoshop interface is pretty simple once you understand where everything is, and it really hasn't changed much in 25 years. Tileable textures. If you get an order to make something tileable or repeatable or seamless, it's called, find out if it needs to be done in both directions, in U and V. So for example, if you've got a wall that you're doing, well, you can repeat it in one direction. All right, but if you've got something like a floor where it's got to be repeated in two directions, that makes a difference. If you don't get any guidance, always assume it's got to repeat in all directions. We're going to make the brick wall repeatable in U and in V. In fact, anytime you just hear the word seamless, it's going to be seamless in U and V unless it's otherwise noted. Anybody who makes a texture, puts it on the internet as a seamless texture, it's going to be U and V. All right, so let's start off with, I've got a file here called Clone Stamp Practice JPEG. We're going to open that, go into Photoshop, talk a little bit about the interface, about some of the tools we're going to use, And this file serves as a good intro to utilizing the clone stamp tool and the healing brush tool, which are going to be our primary tools for removing seams or noticeable features on the brick that you'd be able to spot in a repeating pattern. All right, so let's go here, go to our Photoshop files, and I'm going to choose the clone stamp, right click on it, and open with Photoshop. Always make sure you've got your Photoshop updated, especially as a student where you can afford to, because it's part of your educational Creative Cloud package. Keep the newest version going. All right, many of you are probably familiar with most of the navigation tools and everything in Photoshop, but let's just kind of go over them anyway. All right, on the left side are your tools. If you select a tool, you will get tool options that go across the top, and it will change based on your tool. Now, tool options are sort of like Maya's attributes. They'll tell you, give you some user input into altering that tool. Now, in Photoshop, above the tool options, which run across right underneath the main menus, you've got your main menus, obviously. All the way on the right, the bottom right usually is where you've got your layers and your channels. We know that from working with the templates. Right. Couple of quick navigational things, which I've kind of gone over going into the templates. Command plus and minus will zoom in and out. In Photoshop, you can go all the way into pixel level or all the way out so that your image actually looks like a pixel. Now, when you're zoomed in and you want to navigate around, well, you can use the scroll bars or hold this space bar down, and that will give you the hand tool to let you pan. As long as you have that space bar held down, you can move this around, and it makes it simple. Now, if you get a tool like a brush, what's a shortcut for changing the size of the brush in Photoshop? Photoshop gurus? No? You can, but there's shortcut keys. Shortcut keys would be the brackets, left and right. Right bracket makes it bigger. Kind of hard to see. There we go. Or smaller. Predetermined sizes. You can also go up to the upper right and choose the brush size you want. But brackets work pretty nice. Now, if you're on a PC, it's the same thing there. To zoom in and out on a PC, instead of command, it's going to be control. So you just usually just swap out. Anytime I say command, just think control on a PC. All right. So, questions so far? Make sense? Everybody probably knows all that already. So, when you have an image, a lot of times you may have artifacts in it, you may have blemishes in it. For example, get some old family photos, scan them in. Usually old family photos have creases in them, or they've got areas where some of the image is worn off. Clone stamp tool is really a good tool to utilize to help repair some of those pixels. Now, the thing we use the clone stamp for in making something seamless is we're trying to remove noticeable blemishes and features that become recognizable when you start repeating a pattern. So for example, this is building 4B room 127, computer animation building when we still had carpet in there. And I think they gutted all the rooms. They've all got concrete in them now. But before they ripped all the carpet out, we took a picture of it because it was just lovely bits of filth that we wanted to use as kind of a intro to making or to utilizing what's called the clone stamp tool. All right, so there's a couple of ways of working in Photoshop. One is you alter the original pixels of your image, which means you open an image in Photoshop, it's got a single layer, you start doing stuff to that layer. If you save it, you've changed that layer, you've changed the image completely from the beginning, it's altered. The other way is to use layers on top of that to cover up areas that you want to either hide or change. And that is the basis of what we call a non-destructive workflow, where we always try to maintain that base layer unaltered and then do stuff on top of it. And at any time, we can undo that by hiding layers. Very similar to Substance, right? Substance, you use layers, layers stacked on top of each other. Each layer covers up layer below it. Couple things about Photoshop. Photoshop, if you've got a single layer, you click on it. For all the Photoshop filters that you have at your disposal are all useful. Right? If you've got more than one layer. So for example, if I create another layer and I shift select both layers, all the Photoshop filters are now disabled. I can't use them. They're all grayed out. Photoshop will only allow you to apply a filter to a single layer. Does that make sense? Doesn't matter if you've got that in a group or not. It still recognizes multiple layers. So, having said that, we're going to be doing some duplication of layers and merging them just so we can work and filter those separate from other layers. Now, when we do non-destructive workflow, first thing you want to do actually with any image that you're going to alter in Photoshop, open it up, save it as a PSD. If you save it as a PSD, you stop compressing the file. You guys know how file compression works? No, how you compress a JPEG. You get a JPEG off the internet, right? It says it's 117K. Open it in Photoshop, it's 3 megabytes. Why? Because when you compress something in JPEG, in PNG, or even in TIFF, what you're doing is throwing away information on the premise that you can basically recreate discarded pixels based on the pixels that remain. And that is file compression. So for example, let me go back here, right? Got lots of white on the board. So if this were your image, Photoshop would look at it and go, okay, I got a lot of white pixels there. I can get rid of about 80% of them and recreate them when you open the file again, because they're pretty much all the same, or they have a tolerance of being really close to each other. So Photoshop is not the only program. Any program that opens it up, opens a JPEG, it uncompresses it. What it's trying to do is reconstruct the files or the parts of the file that were removed. And there's a common format that all graphics image programs use in order to reconstruct stuff. So it's not like it's different for everybody. So JPEG is a JPEG. You open it on any computer, it's going to more or less look the same. Now, when you open a file up, it is being reconstructed. If you work on it, save it, and close it, you are basically compressing it again. And what you're doing is getting rid of pixels. So for example, you could get rid of a lot of white pixels here and a few black pixels. That would make the file size much smaller. Less information. So when you open it again, it's going to reconstruct all those discarded pixels based on pixels that remain. And after 10 times, you degrade the quality of the image 50%, because you open it, you work on it, you compress it, you throw stuff away. Open it, reconstruct it, work on it, compress it, throw stuff away. You're basically you keep throwing away stuff and trying to reconstruct it from what's already there. So after 10 times, you degrade the quality of the image 50%, which means it starts to become noticeably artifacty, meaning you'll notice pixels that were white are sometimes off color, or they're not all very smooth. Things are going to start to look really nasty. If you open it in Photoshop and save it as a PSD file, you stop compressing. Photoshop will not throw anything out that it can't reconstruct completely and accurately. That's Photoshop's job. It's an image editing program. So, having said that, the first thing I recommend you do is if you've got an image and you think you might work on it, when you open it in Photoshop, save it as a PSD. It's going to save it as a bigger file size, but you can work on it to your heart's content and save it, and only compress it when you need to in the final version. In fact, if you use the Targa format, it is probably the least lossy of the image formats. Least lossy means you're not going to find that much artifacting or that much information being noticeably destroyed. So, save as. Going to save it as a PSD. So now, the nice thing about Photoshop 2 is it will save layers. If you have multiple layers and save it as a TIFF or a JPEG or a PNG, it discards all your layers. They're gone for good. But Photoshop will keep all the layers. So, first thing you want to do when you start working on something, save it as a PSD. And what we're going to do is, when we start working with the clone stamp, we're actually going to be working on multiple layers. So you're going to have your background layer. That's going to be your original layer. And then we've got a blank layer that I've created on top of it. And all you do is click, the new layer button, and it creates as many layers as you want. If you want to delete layers in Photoshop, how do you delete them? Yeah, you can just hit delete. Just select the layer and hit the delete key. All right, so the reason we have a blank layer is because what we're going to do is we're going to clone out or cover up all these little bits of dirt and imperfections on the carpet. Now, the clone stamp tool looks like a bureaucrat's rubber stamper. And the good thing about it is it allows you to clone from one area or copy pixels and stamp them or paste them into another area. Now, if you write, or actually, if you've got a tool that has a little black triangle on the bottom right, that means there are other tools that are similar to it. So the clone stamp for me is right underneath the brush. The options for the clone stamp that you want to get, whenever we clone, we want the hardness of the brush, and it's still called a brush. We want the hardness of that brush to be 100%. Which means we don't want fuzzy edges on anything we clone. Nothing says, you know, this has been altered or this has been used and changed more than fuzzy or blurry pixels. So keep the hardness at 100%, keep your mode at normal, opacity at 100%, flow at 100%. We're not trying to feather, you know, line weights or build them up. Probably one of the biggest features of the clone stamp is right next to sample. And by default, your sample will be current layer. What you want to do is change that to current and below. What it will do is allow you to sample from a lower layer. So for example, this background layer, and it will allow you to stamp onto your blank layer. So if you forget, here's what's going to happen. You're going to try and clone and then stamp, and there's really nothing there. Remember, this layer is completely blank. So you change sample to current and below. So now when you go to sample or clone, you hold the option key down in the clone stamp tool, and it turns the tool into a little bullseye or a target. That means you are in clone mode. So for example, if I want to remove these little white pieces of dirt here on the carpet in the upper right, hold down option, find an area that is similar to the area you want to cover up. So for example, I want to cover this up. So let me sample, let's try over here. Just going to click, release the option key. And now, just like with a brush, I can change the size of my stamp. And I can just click. And when I click, I have actually pasted or cloned into the blank layer. Notice my background layer is untouched, but my top layer is now, it contains that little cover. So using the clone stamp is actually pretty simple. You always want to clone from an area that's very similar to what you want to cover up. You want to copy from it. So again, I'm going to come over here to the piece of white dirt above it, hold option, find a similar set of pixels, click, release option, take my stamper over and cover it up. Do the same thing over on the far right. This is a little darker because it's brighter in the center. It's got a little vignette thing going on. I think we had a flash on to be able to see this. So let's sample here and clone right there. Don't like it? Command Z. Let's come up here, do that, see how that looks. Oh, it looks a little better. So I'm going to do the same thing on the upper left. Click, or actually hold option, click to sample, release option, And now I'm in stamp mode or sort of paste mode. Does that make sense? Questions? So now all of our changes are on a separate layer. We are not locked in. We have not altered the original image layer at all. Again, non-destructive. We always want to have that pristine original image layer in there so we can go back at any time. Now, for bigger areas, you want to come and you want to clone and stamp from several surrounding areas because you want to mix up the pixels. You don't want to use the same pixels to stamp on all the time. That's going to be noticeable. So here for this bigger piece of, looks like piece of paper ground into the carpet, I'm just going to come over, option, click, release option, kind of stamp. Just going to kind of move my tool around just so I can grab some different pixels from different areas. All trying to make it look kind of random. Now I got this little pull in the carpet here at the bottom. I want to try and sample one of these little seams here and just kind of cover that up right there. So this is really good for actually covering up seams with pieces from another section. Covering up pixels is basically what we're doing. Questions so far? Everybody good? All right, now, there's another tool that we're going to use also, and that is called the healing brush. It works a lot like the clone stamp with one big difference. The healing brush will actually cover up just like the clone, but what it tries to do is average the color from where you've cloned to where you're stamping. So it's like taking two different colors and trying to blend them together, which is really useful when you've got two pieces of brick that are slightly different in hue, and you want them to look like they blend. So the clone stamp, again, a bureaucrat's rubber stamper. The healing brush sort of looks like a little Band-Aid. Come down here, you can see there's spot healing, healing, patch, content aware, red eye. You want healing brush. Healing brush has its own set of options. So just like you did with the clone stamp, for the healing brush, you want to make sure the hardness is set at 100%. Mode should be normal. The source, you want it to be sampled. And sample should be current and below also. Because you want to sample from a lower layer and then clone or stamp on a new layer. It also has its own attributes as far as brush size, stamper size, if you will. It works the same way. Hold option down and you are in sample mode. Click, release, and now you can stamp wherever you want to go. So what I want to show you is what happens if I want to cover up this brassy electrical access cover, but I don't really want to cover it up with carpet. I want it to look like it's been removed and there are, you know, there's residue there from the brass. The brass colors rubbed off on the carpet. So let me get a bigger swatch here. There we go. So I'm going to hold down option, click to clone some pixels here. Now, when I stamp, what it's going to do is use the pattern of the carpet, but it's going to mix that gray with the color of the brass. me do it again. So sample this area, stamp. It's basically trying to mix the color from the two, but take the pattern from the carpet to cover it up. So really good for it, interpolating between two different colors or blending them together. So remember the regular clone stamp, if I did that, let me make this a little bigger, I would just be covering up without any of that brassy color. But the healing brush tries to average the two colors together. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, so if you understand that, those are the basics of being able to utilize a couple of really important tools for getting rid of seams. This will work for photos also, practice on old family photos, you know, just find pixels that are similar to what you want to fix, you can do it. All right, so I'm going to save this. If I close it and open it again, all my layers are there. All set to go. All right, I want to save that because I didn't do anything. All right, so what we're going to do now is basically kind of go through the workflow for making this texture seamless or repeatable. So I'm going to kind of go over the workflow and then we're actually going to do it. So first thing we're going to do is crop it. We want to crop it and keep it square. Why square? Because when you make something repeatable, it's easier if it's square. It will maintain a better aspect ratio. And computers think in square root, power of 2. So a lot of times we just try and keep this square. So we're putting in appropriately proportional chunks of something. Because if you do a rectangle and make it repeat, it might not maintain its shape depending on the object. But making it square, you can guarantee that it's going to be a little easier. So when we crop it, we're going to crop about halfway into the grout at the top and the bottom. Why? Because the bottom's going to line up with the top and you want that grout to line up and look like it's just a normal course of grout. So crop, then we're going to do what's called an offset, which an offset in Photoshop is like taking the image and shifting it in the frame so that your left and right become the center of the frame. And this is where we can paint out our seams. Because when you shift it over, Photoshop is just going to grab the left side, put it on the right, and move it. Now, if you crop your original image correctly, there's going to be less work to clean up or to clone out when you actually go to start working on it. So spend a little time, you'll see we've offset this. We've got a little bit of noticeable seam in the middle, but it's not too bad. We can easily get rid of that by cloning in some brick there where it's missing, using the healing brush or just the clone to cover up any imperfections on separate layers. Then basically what we're going to do is apply a little bit of sharpness to that image, because when images have been compressed and opened and recompressed, they tend to get very soft and fuzzy looking. So a lot of times Photoshop is an image editing tool. It's got tons of really good sharpening tools. We're going to utilize something simple called a high pass filter. It's going to provide a little bit of sharpness, a little bit of crispness between the pixels. And then that's basically going to be our diffuse map. Once you offset it in Photoshop and fix the seams, you don't need to offset it again. When you bring it into Maya, it will automatically be seamless if it looks good in Photoshop. Now, when we're done with that, we're going to be making a bump map out of it. We have to figure out, what do we need from a bump map? Bump maps are black and white. We need information that's, something that's going to go inwards. That's got to be what color? Inwards is black. Something that's going to come up off the surface is going to be white. So we have to figure out, oh, wait, no, this, if I use the brick wall like it is here, all that grout's going to come out like an ice cream sandwich on a hot day. You can take a bite and all the ice cream is going to come out of the sandwich itself, meaning the grout's going to ooze out rather than go in. So in Photoshop, we are going to apply an adjustment layer. And adjustment layers in Photoshop allow us to do effects and filters on a bunch of layers at once without altering the layers themselves. So we're going to invert it. We made it black and white. We inverted it. Now we're going to apply a little bit of, some people would call it contrast and brightness. We're going to use the levels control to make the grout go in a little more, make the bricks come out a little bit more. And that's going to be our bump map. So it's all about understanding and knowing what we need that map to do for us. All right, so let's open up the brick source. So I'm going to right click, open with Photoshop. There it is in all its bricky goodness. First thing I'm going to do, save as PSD. So let's go down here, change it to Photoshop because it was a Targa 2021-12. So now it's a PSD. Now I can have layers. Now I've stopped compressing it. I'm all set to go. Next, we're going to crop it. So the crop tool looks like two right angles. For me, it's the fifth tool down on the left. Now, by default, it will probably be width and height, resolution, and it'll kind of allow you to do it freeform. We don't want that though. What we want to do is we want it to be square. So in the upper left corner of the tool options, you'll see that there is a 1-to-1 square, and that's what we want to use. So no matter how I change the size of this crop, it's going to maintain a square aspect ratio. Now that can drive people a little crazy, but you have to understand, we're going to move it in a couple of directions, and then we can actually shift the image around inside of the crop too. So first thing I want to do, let me zoom in a little. And you can do that in these tools. I want to try and get a better view. What I want to do is bring my top down and put it roughly about halfway into the grout. Now you'll notice that my bricks are not all perfectly level. Some are a little tilted. Yeah, that's all right. Wasn't put in perfectly. So I'm just going to try and get it as best I can about halfway. It might be a little close here, but it's roughly about halfway in most of the others. Now that I've done that, I want to do the same thing to the bottom. I want to get rid of those partial pieces of brick. And I want to go about halfway in the bottom. The idea is top is going to line up with the bottom. And that means those two half pieces of grout will make a full course. Now, the problem is in this that I've still got some of that watermark showing through. And everybody's first reaction is to go, oh, oh, crap. You know, you try and move it to the left, but it's not going to work like that. So you just want to take the image and shift it. And if you do it very carefully, Photoshop has it realizes you want to take it on one axis and it'll kind of snap a little. And what I want to do is just kind of line it up. Find the section where I can kind of line it up. So I'm going to utilize this brick right here. Put it about halfway in the grout. Be about halfway in the grout here. Notice the small little pieces of brick above it. Well, it's going to line up with the other side because this part that's cut off is right here. Does that make sense? Questions? Now, when you're working with tools in Photoshop, a lot of times before you actually commit to it, you know, this is all kind of in temporary memory right now. If you want to commit to it in Photoshop, you can either hit the Enter key or click the little check button that's up in the tool options. So I'm just going to click the checkbox. Now, before I save this, I want to make sure that this is going to work. Because if it doesn't work, I can just Z back to before I cropped it, recrop it again and try it. What I'm looking for is to find out how good a job I did cropping it by applying the offset tool, the offset filter to it. So to do that, we've still got a single layer here. We're going to go up to Filter, Other, Offset. Now, anytime in Photoshop, you've got a menu option that has three little dots or an ellipse. That means you're going to get some kind of user input. Photoshop's going to ask you what you want. If there are no three dots, Photoshop will apply that without any further input from you, meaning it's a command, do it. This offset's going to bring up this little window here. And by default, your horizontal and vertical should be 0. Now, in your offset, you want to make sure preview is turned on. And then you say to yourself, okay, well, great. How much do we offset it? Well, since we cropped it, it now has a new size. That new size we can find down in the lower left portion of the Photoshop interface, right down here. You guys see where I'm pointing at? Right there. Mine says 787 by 788. And you say, wait a minute. Photoshop told us that it was going to keep it square. Why is one set of pixels off? Well, Photoshop couldn't decide whether where we cropped it was like a half pixel or so. If you're within 1 pixel from each other, it's square. pixels very small. So what we want to do is we want to find out what is half of one of these numbers. And usually the two numbers should be the same. I prefer to choose an even number. So I'm going to pick 788. So for example, if you've got 789, if you choose half of 789, you're going to come up with 394.5. Just forget the 0.5, just use 394. But for me, I've got 788. That's the number I'm going to use. 788 divided by 2. That's going to be my offset in horizontal and vertical because it's half of the height and half of the width. Now, your numbers might be different. It's whatever your numbers are there. So 394, you'll notice that Photoshop shifted over horizontally. It found a seam here. Now I want the top and the bottom to line up. So that's 394 also. Now notice I didn't hit enter or anything. I'm in preview. So what it's doing is it's shifting the left to the center, the top to the center. So it's shifting it down and it shifts the pixels to the right. So this is what my seamless texture looks like right now. What I want to do is determine, is this good enough for me or do I need to go back and recrop it? If you've got all kinds of bizarre stuff going on, undo it, go back, recrop it, keep it square. You want to try to minimize as much clone stamp work as possible. So this will work. I'm going to click OK. And at this point, I'm going to save Photoshop because I'm committed to now cloning out these seams. So I'm going to get out of that crop tool. So I can see I've got to add some brick here, top and bottom. I've got some grout issues here. I've got some brick issues. I've got some areas where the colors don't line up. Areas where the colors don't line up, perfect for healing brush. Areas where you got to repair pixels, clone stamp. You got to cover them up. So I'm going to start, like I always do, create a new blank layer. Remember, everything's about layers here. Brand new blank layer. Get your clone stamp tool. And let's make the size of this appropriate because I want to fix this area right up here. And you can zoom in. So let's try that. Basically, what I want to do is try and bring this up here. So let's hold down. Yeah, not real happy about that bump, but let's try this one. So what I want to try and do is just get this to line up. Now, I'm also going to, let's clone this area here. Actually, I want to make that smaller because this is small work here. So I just like to keep sampling. This way I'm not using the same pixels all the time. All right, so that area, that's been fixed. Whenever I do up here, I've got to do at the bottom. So now I need to fix this section. This section is probably going to be a little bit easier. And let's just go in. All right, so I did the top and the bottom. I'm going to look for any other areas that I need to use the clone stamp on. This could be healing brush. This little piece of the corner here. Yeah, it's not really a whole lot. Just want to do that with it. And that section right there, this line, I could probably just come in and do this. Just to fix it up a little. So here I've got grout. What I'm going to do is find a nice area where I can get grout and basically just try and get rid of that seam. I might want to change positions just to get some different grout there. This, I think I might try the healing brush on, healing brush. This one definitely looks like clone stamp. I got to fix that little piece there. And remember, if you don't like it, you can Z back. Yes. Should be able to click down here and it should tell you height and width. No? Down at the bottom, it tells you inches. You might want to go to the preferences also. If you go to general, yeah, if you want to go to general, you can go to units and you can change it to rulers, pixels, type points, whatever you want. You found it though? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, whenever you're dealing with images, always put in Photoshop, always make it pixels. Unless you're doing something like print work where you've got to actually be, you know, centimeters, millimeters, or inches. Pretty much everybody deals with pixels. All right. So healing brush is going to come in, going to try and average this out. So let's try sampling here and let's see what we get. So again, we're just trying to break up any of those seams that we might have visible. Now you also want to take a look at the center here. The horizontal center. Usually that's not too bad. The pixels line up pretty good, but if you see anything noticeable, you'll have to clone that out also. So in the end, you should have a background layer, at least one layer that you've got cloned. And don't forget, in Photoshop, you can rename your layers with spaces, special characters. Photoshop doesn't care. It's not Maya. So, well, it's not really clone stamp, but good enough. Now, at this point, anybody got any questions so far? All right, so at this point, what I'm going to do is take the two layers that I've got a background layer, and I've got my clone layer. And what I want to do is I want to apply a filter to them. But the problem is, if I select both layers, Photoshop does not allow you to apply a filter to more than one layer. So what we do is we select the two layers. We have to basically duplicate them. So with those layers selected, you right click, you duplicate layers, duplicate layer dialog, just click OK. Photoshop will rename them the same with the word copy and highlight them. And these two duplicated layers we can now merge together and apply a filter to that layer. So the reason we're doing this is so that we can have a separate layer to apply a little bit of sharpening and allow the layer underneath to show through. So these two layers are copied. Let's right click and merge layers. So now this merged layer is going to become our high pass filter. High pass filter works by allowing what are called the midtones to come through. Now, when you're dealing with an image, you're always going to have brights, darks, or highlights, shadows, midtones. Most images contain a lot of what we call midtone information, grays, 50% grays. So what we want to do is we want to get a little more contrast between the light and the dark pixels and allow just the plain grays to come through. So to do that, we are going to select the new high pass filter layer that we made, go up to filter, go to other, and high pass filter is the second filter down. So remember, we duplicated the background in the clone stamp. We merged those duplicated layers together, made them the high pass filter. And now we're going to apply the high pass filter to that layer. So high pass, by default, high pass, I think, what are your high pass set to? 0.1 by default? 10? Oh yeah, 10. Oh, that's magnificent. Yeah, 10 is too much. You don't really want to filter an image 10 pixels at a time. For this, we want to filter roughly about, well, between 1 and 2. I always pick 1.5. Now, what that's going to do is make the contrast between the highs and the lows a little bit more, but not nearly as much as 10. So 1.5, what that's going to do is basically, well, it's going to by default cover up our other work, but we're going to use this with what's called a Photoshop blend mode. Now, blend modes in Photoshop allow layers to interact with each other based on the blend mode that you choose. And the nice thing about the new versions of Photoshop is you can go down and just take a look at what each blend mode does before you choose it. It'll preview it in your image. So right now you're thinking, okay, great. We just destroyed all that work by covering it up with a really disgusting gray. But in the blend modes, let's go through darken, multiply. No. What we're looking for is something that will allow the normal pixel look, screen, dodge, and lighten. And overlay is the one. Overlay will allow the midtones to come through, and only the midtones from these two layers, and then just add a little bit of sharpness to the pixels in the highs and the darks. Now, what that does, in effect, it makes it look sharper. It gives a little more contrast between pixels. So this is what it looks like without that layer on and with it. Not sure you can see it on the screen, but there should be just a little bit of a sharpen to it. Right now, it's a little blurry, and it should look just a little crisper. So now we've got 3 layers. The bottom 2 are being filtered through the high pass, and the high pass is providing that little bit of extra crispness so that it looks sharper. We're getting a little more contrast between the darks and the lights. Questions? What was the what? It comes in at 10. I usually like to go somewhere between 1 and 2. I generally don't like to go more than a pixel because we're just trying to sharpen pixels. I don't want to sharpen big chunks of pixels. Yeah, too sharp. But here's the good thing. With this being a separate layer, you can actually take the opacity and dial it down. So even at 5, you could take your opacity and drop it down so it's not quite so noticeable. Now, at 5, you're still probably going to get too much contrast. So you might want to dial it down a little bit. But like I said, this acts sort of like an intensity slider. You want to dial it down a little bit? Great. Take some of the edge off of that sharpness, because if you over sharpen it, it can start to look grainy, and we start to really notice the pixels a little bit more. The idea is to get more contrast without drawing attention to pixels themselves. Make sense? Questions? All right, so with this, I'm just going to keep my high pass filter opacity turned up. I'm going to save it, and this will become our base color for Maya. So now it's still a PSD, but what I'm going to do is save as. And of course, in Photoshop, it won't let you save as. What do I have to do? Yeah, I got to click on save a copy. There we go. Save a copy. I want to take the word, well, let's change the format to Targa. Let's get rid of the word copy. And I'm going to put base color. This way, if I give it to somebody, they're going to go, oh, this goes into base color. And they'll write where it goes. Also, do yourself a favor, name them for yourself so you don't go crazy. All right, so this is going to be my Targa save, 24-bit. We don't need 32 yet. Click OK, and we're good to go. So we've got a color map. Now we want to use this to create our bump map from. So a bump map is a basic height map. In a bump map, what do we want from our bump map? Yep, we want black and white. What's black going to do? It's going to get lowered. Yeah, it's going to go in. So black or dark areas of your image go down or in, and light or white look like they raise up or come off the surface. Now, for this, we don't need color information, but we don't want to get rid of the color information permanently. If you do that, you've basically gotten rid of all the work that you have, and you couldn't come in and fix this if you wanted to. So what we do is we apply an adjustment layer, which the icon for it is down at the bottom of layers. It's a half dark, half light circle. If you click on it, it will basically give you a big long list of stuff. What we want is right in the middle, it's called black and white. What it will do is create a brand new layer on top and filter all the other layers underneath through it and convert red to the proper shade of gray, green to the proper shade of gray, and blue to the proper shade of gray. These are industry standard kind of recognized conversions for making something black and white or grayscale in this case. Now, the nice thing is I want to get my color back, just turn the visibility of that layer off and you're right there. It does not require you to adjust the properties of that black and white adjustment layer. So we made it black and white. Save Photoshop. Next, will this do? So we already know we don't need color information. Will this give us the result we want if we pop this in and use it as a bump? No. So we need to invert it. Now, you could go up to layer and or image and you can invert it. Actually, yeah. We could go up there and invert it, but that would do it permanently to the entire file. So we want to go back to our adjustment layers. Down toward the bottom, there is an invert. So all that's going to do is flip black and white. And if you had any colors, it would invert those colors to the opposite end of the color wheel. So now we've got a black and white file with information going in the right direction, theoretically, that we want. But there's just one other thing. I would like to get a little more contrast. Oh yeah. One other thing I forgot to mention. In a bump map, 50% gray gives you absolutely no change in the surface. So in a bump map, if you don't want anything to happen, make your whole thing gray. You paint in the areas that you want to go up, white, and you make the areas you want to go down or in black or dark. So 50% gray, no change at all. It doesn't go up or down, it's flat. So knowing that, take a look at the brick. The brick is mostly 50% gray. That's like right down the center. So our grout's a little bit darker. So the grout's going to go in a little, but the bricks are going to more or less stay the same. What we want is we want to bring the bricks out just a little bit more. We want the grout to be a little darker. We want the bricks to be a little lighter. You can do that a ton of different ways in Photoshop. There's brightness and contrast. There's levels. There's curves. There's exposure. They can all get you sort of to the same place, but I prefer levels, and I'll show you why. So we're going to use another adjustment layer. So down here, right toward the top, you'll see brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure. The reason I like levels is because of this little picture right here, this graph, this little histogram. All right, so in this histogram, these are your highlights. Basically, the light part of your image. These are your darks or shadows. And these are what we call midtones. Most photos, take a photo of anybody, put it into Photoshop, go in, take a look at your levels, and you'll find most of the information in a photo is a lot of mid-tone information. We have lots of kind of neutral values in there. Now, the thing about this histogram is it tells you exactly where the information is. Where's my biggest spike? Yeah, right here in the midtones. Got a little bit of a spike here. That is where the grout is. But take a look at the brights. There's virtually no light information until right about here, where it starts to go up. Let me clean this up a little. Okay. So this is wasted information. Plus, if I take my highs and I say, okay, Photoshop, I don't have any pure whites. My brightest part of the image is going to be right here. Look what it does. And I go, Photoshop, my darks are going to be where the grout is. And that's going to be right about here. Now I can take my midtones. So if I move my midtones towards the bright areas, what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of darkness here. If I move my midtones toward the darks, now I got a lot more white. So what I like to do is keep my grout sort of dark, but not super dark. Get my midtones so they're, or my highlights so they're light gray. And then take my midtones and just push the midtones so I get a little more brightness for what would normally be the 50% gray. So now I've made this whole area in here. So this is what it looked like originally. And now we've got a little more contrast there. And that little bit of contrast is going to help your bump map to define the areas you want to be visible as far as surface relief, because that's really what it's about. Fooling the camera into believing there's a surface changed by something going in or something coming up. Questions? Comments? Make sense? Now, if you're doing this in Substance, Substance is doing this sort of behind the scenes for you. but there's something really valuable about learning how to do it to an image in Photoshop manually, because not every object is going to need substance, and you may work somewhere where they're not using substance on a project. So, like I said, what I want to try to do is get a little more contrast here. And some people don't like the fact that there's all kinds of irregularities in the bricks. I happen to like it because most brick is not smooth unless you paint it and paint it and paint it and paint it. Most of the time, brick is imperfect. It's rough. It's got scratches. It's got dents. It's got bubbles. It's got little, areas that come up off the surface. You got bubbles that were in the brick when it was being cured and they broke and they've got an indentation. So all this little bit of imperfection, I think, works to make the brick look a little more believable. All right, so we could make this, be a little more contrasty. Could make the grout a little darker. I could pull this down a little bit, make it a little brighter. And it's really just knowing what these sliders are doing. This is basically our brightest part of our image now. This is our darkest part right here. And the darks and the midtones are really close together. So I'm going to save this, do a save as. This is going to become my bump map. So again, I got to make a copy. Come down, make it a Targa file. Call it bump. There's my base color. Now I've got a bump map. Targa options, 24-bit. And now we've got two maps that we made in one Photoshop file. And if I need to go back and make changes to my color map, I just turn off my Photoshop layers. I need to make a change to my bump, turn on the bump layers, make your changes, save it out. Questions? Make sense? So now we've got Targa files. Let's get those into Maya. So I'm going to save Photoshop one last time and quit out. Why? Because Photoshop and Maya don't like each other. And yeah, I have to quit out of one in order to be able to record at the same time that I'm doing lecture. So let's quit out of Photoshop. Wait for Photoshop. And oh, I'm going to quit out of PowerPoint too, because we're pretty much done right here. Before I do anything else, what I want to do is I want to take these two maps that I've made and I want to bring those, where should they go? First off, source images. So let's take them and copy them. In fact, a lot of times what I will do is take my PSD also, put it into source images. This way, if I need to work on it, my PSD is right there. So these three, let's move them to my source images. All right, Zen Garden, source images. Let's just drag that over here. And we're set to go in theory. So let's fire up Maya. Any questions while I'm waiting for Maya to start up? right, looks like Maya's done. I'm going to set project, even though I just opened it. I don't trust Maya. All right, let's go lecture 8. All right, so there is my default brick. I'm going to assign a new material to it. New AI standard surface. And this is going to be seamless brick. Now, some people like to bring the color map right in and play around with that. I prefer to bring the bump map in because I want to see what my bump map is doing before I get too excited about throwing color in. Because if I put color in, it's going to be a little hard to see the bump. So let's do the bump first. What I'm going to do is make my base color 0.18, just like the default AI standard that we made for the entire scene. And first off, where do I plug my bump maps into? What part of the material? So far, all the other maps are easy. Geometry, very good, thank you. So that's all the way down toward the bottom. It's about 2/3 of the way down, maybe a little less. Maybe somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3. So under geometry, there is bump mapping. All I want to do is click the checker button next to bump mapping. In create render node, what do I want to do here? Yep, file. And the nice thing about the create render node is notice that on the left side, there are four sections that are highlighted. So it gives you this super long list. The nice thing about just clicking on 2D textures is it shortens your list. So now I've got 2D file. It creates a bump utility. My file is plugged into bump value. There's my tab right there. And this is where I want to bring my bump map in. All right, so I want to select my base color. No, actually, no, we're doing bump. So I'm going to select my bump, click open, and it will sort of give you a nasty looking preview. And you can see that, well, just like when I brought the original file in, it's way too big. So let's work on getting the scale. So how do I make those bricks smaller? So what I need is I need to get to my 2D placement. So it's not visible here in the attribute editor. If it's not visible in the attribute editor, instead of driving yourself crazy, just open up the hypershade. And here's my seamless brick. I'm just going to right click on my seamless brick and graph network. And this is what I want to select, my place 2D. So when I click on my place 2D, now it gives me my repeat U and repeat V. I want to make this repeat itself across my surface a little more. So looks a little better. Still pretty big. Let's try that. Still pretty big. Let's try 4. Now you'll notice that 4 looks better, but the bricks are still really stretched. So we can actually make it repeat more in U or in V, depending on what we want to make smaller. So let's try U and see what happens. Let's try making it 8. It was U. No, it was me. So this is what it looks like with both U and V at 4. We get this really stretched brick here. But if I take U and change it to 8, it makes those bricks a little more proportionate. Now, these are probably still a little big here. So let's try 10 and 5, make it a little smaller. Basically what you're trying to do is get it to repeat so that it looks like an actual brick pattern. That's not too stretched. Now you could also do this by laying out the UVs again, right? Do a planar projection, scale it so it looks better, but UV should work on here. All right, does that make sense? Questions? All right, so we scaled it. I went with 12 and 5. Maybe I should go 12 and 6. I don't know. That's not bad. So it looks like it's got to be twice as many repeats in U as in V. Let's see what this looks like when we render it. So looks pretty bricky. And looks like I'm getting kind of blown out there. So yeah, I think I'm just going to lower. Well, let me leave it at 1 for now. Now, don't forget the default amount of bump is always too high. So I recommend you start your bump at 0.5 or sorry, 0.1, work your way down. And honestly, I usually wind up going down to like 0.05, somewhere like that. Maybe even lower. Because the whole idea is you want to see a subtle bump pattern, but not something ridiculous. All right, now I've got my brick in there. I've kind of got it, kind of got the scale that I want. I really need to get reference before I make this a final decision. But for the sake of brevity, I just want to move this demo on. What I want to do is now let's put the color in. So where does my color go? Yep. So I got to select my material, base color. Absolutely. So I click on the checker button next to the base color. What do I want to do here? All right. So I want to go 2D texture, file. In the file attribute, let's go to image name and let's plug our color in. So here's our color. Pop it in there and oh, look at that. That looks good, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. So what's going on is we spent time getting it to repeat for the bump, but now that we've put another file in there, it has its own place 2D. Remember, every time you put a file in, it's going to have its own place 2D. So now we've got two different place 2Ds driving two different files. I don't like that. Wouldn't it be better to have one place 2D drive my bump and my color? And the answer is, yeah, you want that. This way, you've only got to change it in one location. It will change all your maps. Did everybody hear that? Does that make sense? So this requires a little not Photoshop, a little Maya wizardry. And actually, it's black magic. It's one of those things where it's Maya and nothing is as easy as it looks. So now that I've scared you, it's not really that bad. So this is the one I want to use. What I want to do is I'm going to just rename this so I know this is I'm going to call it my master. Because I want this to drive my color also. Now, you would think, oh, can't you just take that and drag it over here? Well, no, look what it does. It gives you all this. Scary. The way you do it, let me zoom in a little bit more. So notice that our place 2Ds are plugged in here. What we're going to do is these little icons next to the orange bubbles right here, they are basically level of detail. They're showing you, well, they correspond to up here too. They show you all kinds of connections, every connection, and then just what you need. Feel free to experiment with them, but if it frightens you, just collapse it to the main thing. So what I want to do is I want to get this to drive this. And what I have to do is go to my master place 2D, hold the command key down. Right here in this little kind of level of detail icon, middle mouse click and drag and oops, I don't have middle mouse. Right, pen, got it. Sorry. Command, middle mouse click, drag this to the icon of my color node, my file node, and release my mouse. So let me do that again. So master place 2D wanted to drive the color. Hold command, middle mouse click on the master place 2D, looks like a Burger King icon. Middle mouse click, drag, drop it on the little picture of your color file node, release the mouse, and it will make all the connections for you. And now in my viewport, all is well. You don't have to hide the sharp objects. So now when we render, color and bump line up. Now, notice it's really bright and blown out. That's mostly because we got a lot of energy going on, just like we did with the table. So it was getting all washed out. So you can see with the bump, it gives you that surface relief detail. Now, without it, let me go turn the bump off so we can see exactly what the bump is doing. Let's go to 0. Nice and flat. No bump, bump. So even just that little bit of detail makes a huge difference on the texture. Does that make sense? So there'll be times when you may not need any other maps, but you might need a bump map because you're close enough to the object where you should be able to see like little cracks or little indentations, or the fact that one part of the surface is a little higher than the other. Does that make sense? Questions? Well, the default bump is this. Let's take a look at it. So it's this, which looks kind of super dark and ridiculous. So I recommend start at 0.1, but I always work my way down because with a bump map, less is more. You don't want to draw attention to the fact that there's a bump on it. You don't want people to go, whoa, bump map. No, you want them to go, wow, that looks natural. So from here, honestly, I always go down from 0.1 to 0.05. I've gone down as low as 0.005 because I just wanted a very, very subtle detail. But how much bump you need really is determined by what you see in your reference. The closer you are to an object, the more detail you're going to see. If you're far enough back, sometimes you can't see anything, like on our walls. You go back about 10 feet, you can't really see that orange peel. But when you get a little closer, you start to see the little bumpy areas. And that's really what you're looking for in your reference as to whether your bump needs to be more or less. Good question. Really good. Any others? All right, so today, start finding textures for the scene you want to do. If you don't like your reference, time to go find new reference, find stuff that makes you happy. Start looking for textures that will work and give you what you want. Now, another reason for changing reference, you can't find your texture. Instead of spending like, 3 or 4 days looking for a single texture, find different reference with a texture you know you can get. All right, Frank will do another little presentation today about starting for texturing in labs, so it'll kind of help out a lot also. So basic texturing with a photo texture off the internet can be simple if it's already seamless. You can just throw it on and see what it looks like in Maya. Or like we did with the brick wall, you may need to take it into Maya and make a bump map from it, or make it seamless if it's not seamless. Now, some textures like dirt or stones will take a lot more work because there's a lot more detail. Stones are really small, they're all different shapes. It's really hard to make that seamless. So don't get too ambitious. All right, so let's go to lunch and come back to lab at 6 o'clock. And don't forget Sunday, Substance Painter Day. Yes. Yeah. All right. Let me stop